The rain pounded against the window of the small suburban house in New York as Emily finished preparing dinner. The scent of homemade lasagna filled the simple yet cozy home. She glanced at the clock on the wall, her heart tightening. It was past 9 at night, and her husband, Richard Lancaster, still hadn't come home. Richard had always been an ambitious man, determined to conquer the world. When they first met, he was just a young man from a humble background, full of dreams. While Emily worked at a coffee shop to help pay for her sick mother's expenses, they fell madly in love, and even without money, they were happy. Emily believed that their love was strong enough to overcome any hardship. As the years passed, Richard's career began to take off. His talent for business led him to start an investment company, and over time, his fortune skyrocketed. Emily had always been by his side, supporting his decisions, sacrificing her own dreams to help him succeed. But the richer Richard became, the more distant he grew. In recent weeks, he had been cold, detached. He spent hours on the phone, left the house without saying where he was going, and when he returned, he avoided Emily's gaze. Deep down, she knew something was wrong. That night, after waiting for hours, Emily finally heard the sound of keys at the door. Her heart pounded. She rushed to the living room and saw Richard walk in, looking tired but showing no trace of guilt. "You're late, again," she said, trying to keep the anguish out of her voice. Richard sighed, loosening his tie. "I had an important meeting. You know how my job is, Emily." She bit her lip, holding back tears. "Richard, I just want to understand. What's happening to us? You barely look at me. You hardly talk to me. We used to be so close." He averted his gaze and walked over to the bar, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "Things change, Emily. I changed." Those words pierced her heart like a sharp blade. You met someone else, didn't you?" Her voice trembled. Richard remained silent for a moment, then let out an impatient sigh. "Emily, I don't want to lie to you. Yes, there's someone else." Her world collapsed. "How could you do this to me? I stood by your side through every hardship. I sacrificed everything for you, Richard." He looked at her with an icy gaze. "I know, and I'm grateful for everything, but I want more. And you, well, you're no longer a part of that." His words hit like a punch to the gut. Emily felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. "Who is she?" she asked, her throat tightening. Richard took a sip of whiskey before answering. "A model, Bella Devereaux. She makes me feel alive in a way I haven't felt in years." Emily felt bile rise in her throat. A model, of course. Now that he had money, he wanted to live out a fantasy with a stunning woman. "So that's it? You're just going to throw me away like I never meant anything to you?" Richard didn't answer. He simply walked to the bedroom, grabbed a suitcase that was already packed, and headed for the door. "I've made my decision, Emily. You deserve someone who fits your life, and I deserve someone who fits mine." The door closed behind him, and with it, all of Emily's dreams shattered. In the days that followed, Emily was in shock. The house felt empty, the silence unbearable. Newspapers and magazines were soon plastered with stories about Richard's new life alongside the breathtaking Bella. They attended lavish events, traveled the world, and flaunted their happiness on social media. Mutual friends started avoiding her. Emily realized that now that Richard was a millionaire, she no longer belonged in that world. She tried to move on, but the pain was crushing. At night, she wondered if Richard had ever truly loved her, and as she stared at photos of her ex-husband beaming beside his new muse, a seed of revenge began to take root inside her. He had discarded her. But one day, he would regret it. The days dragged on like an endless nightmare. Emily couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every corner of the house felt haunted by the memories of the man who once swore he loved her. The couch where they used to watch movies together, the table where they shared dinners filled with laughter, the bedroom where they made promises that now felt like lies. It was all a graveyard of memories. The humiliation was unbearable. The tabloids and gossip sites wouldn't stop talking about them. Richard Lancaster and Bella Devereaux were the couple of the moment. The model paraded beside the tycoon like a trophy draped in designer gowns, diamonds, and a happiness that seemed to mock Emily's pain. She tried to ignore it, but the images were everywhere. The internet was flooded with cruel comments about how Bella was an upgrade for Richard, implying that Emily had never been good enough for a man like him. Then came the final blow. 2 weeks later, Emily went out to buy groceries at the local market, keeping her head down, trying to avoid the pitying glances and whispered remarks. But as she passed a newsstand, her eyes were drawn to a brutal headline. Richard Lancaster finalizes divorce. Model Bella Devereaux spotted wearing a $3 million engagement ring. Emily's stomach twisted. $3 million. Why did it hurt so much? Money had never meant anything to her. But knowing that Richard had bought a multi-million-dollar ring for Bella while discarding her like an old burden was a deep, cruel cut. She turned into the nearest alley and broke down in tears. But amidst the sobs, something shifted. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was fury. Emily spent days in silence, reflecting. She could spend the rest of her life crying, wallowing in sorrow, or she could turn her pain into something far more powerful. One night, sitting at the old kitchen table, she picked up a notepad and started writing. Every memory, every sacrifice, every humiliation Richard had put her through. And beside them, a single goal, revenge. But not just any revenge. She didn't want to simply hurt him. She wanted Richard to feel the same pain she had felt. She was going to destroy him. Emily had always been smart. Before getting married, she had dreams of becoming a businesswoman. But to support Richard, she had given it all up. Now it was time to rebuild the woman she was meant to be. With the little money she had left, Emily enrolled in finance and investment courses. If Richard had become a tycoon, she could learn to play the same game. At first, it was tough. The business world was dominated by men like Richard, arrogant, ruthless, and willing to crush anyone who seemed weak. But Emily was no longer weak. She studied day and night, absorbing every detail about the financial market, investments, and business strategies. The knowledge Richard had spent years acquiring, now she had it too. She sold the house they once shared. The place where she had been betrayed would no longer be her prison. She took the money and invested it in her own consulting firm. She started small, working with women who, like her, had been betrayed, abandoned, or underestimated. Little by little, her reputation grew. Months passed and Emily started making money, a lot of money. She learned how to handle investors, negotiate contracts, and build strategic alliances. And then, the moment she had been waiting for arrived. She found out that Richard was expanding his business and needed new investors for a multi-million-dollar project. That's when Emily knew. Her revenge was just beginning. 2 years had passed since Richard Lancaster abandoned Emily. The fragile, broken woman she once was had become someone entirely different. Emily was no longer the devoted, submissive wife who had sacrificed everything for a man who discarded her like an old possession. No. Now she was a powerful woman. After years of hard work and relentless study, her financial consulting firm had grown exponentially. At first, her focus was on helping women who had gone through similar situations. Betrayed, wives, women in need of a fresh start. But as her influence in the business world expanded, Emily realized she could go even further. She diversified her investments, built strategic alliances, and in less than 2 years, she had become a powerhouse in the financial market. Her name was now respected in the same elite circles Richard moved in. But Emily wasn't done yet. Now it was time for the final blow. Emily knew that Richard was expanding his business. He wanted to break into the tech industry and needed heavyweight investors to bring his vision to life. His new project, Lancaster Innovations, required a massive financial investment. And that's when Emily saw the perfect opportunity. Using the network she had built along her journey, she discreetly positioned herself among investors interested in Richard's project. They had no idea that Emily knew the man they were considering backing better than anyone else. But Emily knew one thing. Richard was always driven by his ego. He loved the game of business, but more than that, he loved winning. He would never suspect that the woman he once discarded was about to become his greatest enemy. After months of carefully monitoring the situation, Emily finally got what she wanted, a meeting with Richard. But she wasn't going as Emily Lancaster. That name no longer existed. Now she was Emily Carter, CEO of a billion-dollar firm and one of the most influential women in finance. When Richard received word that the renowned Emily Carter was interested in investing in his project, he was ecstatic. He knew that if he could secure her backing, other investors would follow. What he didn't know was that Emily Carter was the same woman he had walked away from without a second glance. On the night of the meeting, Emily chose her outfit with surgical precision. A sleek black dress, flawless makeup, and a gaze that was cold and calculating. She was no longer the fragile wife who had once cried alone at home. When she arrived at the luxurious restaurant where the meeting was set to take place, an assistant greeted her and led her to the private table. And then, she saw him. Richard Lancaster was still a charming man, dressed in expensive suits with a confident smile. But something about him had changed. Maybe it was the marks of time, or maybe it was the uncertainty of a man starting to realize that his empire wasn't as solid as it seemed. He stood up to greet her, completely unaware of who was sitting before him. "Miss Carter, it's a pleasure to finally meet you. I've heard a lot about you," Richard said, extending his hand. Emily shook it firmly, her smile enigmatic. "The pleasure is all mine, Mr. Lancaster." Richard pulled out a chair for her, having no idea he was about to face the biggest downfall of his life. Throughout dinner, Richard confidently presented his project, speaking like a man who believed he was in complete control. He explained how Lancaster Innovations had the potential to revolutionize the tech industry, promising astronomical returns. Emily listened intently, pretending to be impressed. "It sounds like an interesting proposal, Mr. Lancaster. I do enjoy investing in innovative ideas. But tell me, what are the risks involved?" she asked, testing him. Richard smiled as if he had already rehearsed the answer. "Almost none. Of course, there are always challenges in this sector, but with the right investors, this will be one of the most profitable ventures in the coming years." Emily leaned forward slightly, narrowing her eyes. "Almost none, you say? And what about your accumulated debts over the past few months? Or the multi-million-dollar contract you recently lost?" Richard blinked a few times, caught off guard. "How do you know about that?" Emily smiled, taking a sip of her wine before replying. "I do my homework before investing, Mr. Lancaster. I know more about your company than you think." The tension on his face became evident. "But that's not a problem." He tried to brush it off. "With the right investment, these minor setbacks will be resolved." Emily leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs with elegance. "Minor setbacks? I'd call it an impending financial collapse." Richard went pale. "What do you mean by that?" Emily placed an envelope on the table. Inside were documents detailing every financial failure of Richard's company, every debt, every strategic mistake, every budget shortfall. He picked up the papers and started flipping through them, sweat forming on his forehead. "How did you get this?" he asked, incredulous. Emily tilted her head slightly and smiled. "I know you, Richard. I know how you do business. Your habits, your weaknesses. I've spent years studying how you operate." That was when Richard finally looked at her, really looked at her. And in that moment, it hit him. "Emily." His name escaped his lips in a shocked whisper. She smiled, satisfied with the panic on his face. "Yes, Richard, your former wife, the woman you threw away like she was nothing." Richard was silent for a moment, his mind struggling to process what was happening. You planned this?" Emily leaned forward, her eyes as cold as ice. "No, you handed this to me on a silver platter. Your arrogance brought you here. Did you really think you could destroy me without consequences? That I'd stay in that house forever, crying over you?" Richard swallowed hard. For the first time, he wasn't in control. Emily slowly stood up, grabbing her purse. "I'm not investing in you, Richard. In fact, I'll make sure no serious investor puts a single cent into your project. Your company will sink, and I'll have front row seats to watch it happen." She leaned in closer and whispered, "You taught me that the world isn't made for the weak. Now it's your turn to learn that lesson." And with that, she walked away, leaving Richard alone, ruin knocking at his door. The name Emily Carter was making waves in the business world. The woman who had been abandoned with nothing 2 years ago was now one of the most influential investors in the United States. Her rise in the financial market had been meteoric, but it wasn't luck. It was strategy. Emily had studied, learned, and built alliances. She connected with the right investors, established an impeccable reputation, and became someone people respected. While Richard Lancaster lived in luxury, unaware that his empire was crumbling beneath him, Emily worked behind the scenes, waiting for the perfect moment to pull the rug out from under his feet. Now, that moment had arrived. Richard was desperate for investors to launch his new company, Lancaster Innovations, but the financial world was ruthless. No one would invest without solid guarantees, and Emily would make sure those guarantees never came. Using her connections, she began spreading information about Lancaster Innovations' financial instability. She knew Richard was drowning in hidden debt, betting everything on future promises and relying entirely on outside investors to keep his project afloat. But in the business world, trust is everything, and Emily made sure his was completely destroyed. Within a week, 3 of the top investors Richard had been courting pulled out of their deals. Contracts he had considered locked in suddenly vanished. Headlines began questioning the stability of Lancaster Innovations. Ambitious venture or a bubble about to burst? The king of finance is losing his crown? Richard was furious. "Who's behind this?" he roared at his lawyers. But there was no proof. Emily was careful. She knew how to play this game better than he had ever imagined. And this was only the beginning. As Richard's company began to crumble, Emily stepped into the public spotlight with full force. She started giving interviews, positioning herself as a visionary, an innovator in the business world. Her name grew stronger by the day. Then came the most devastating blow for Richard. The prestigious financial magazine Fortune Business decided to publish a special feature on 2 key figures in the industry: Emily Carter, the woman who revolutionized female investment; Richard Lancaster, the tycoon in decline. Emily's interview was flawless. Dressed in a sharp white suit, her posture confident and her gaze razor-sharp, she answered every question with poise. When asked about Lancaster Innovations and its looming bankruptcy, she gave a subtle smile and said, "There's always room for new businesses in the market, but only the well-prepared survive. Some people believe they can sustain an empire on arrogance and empty promises, but time always reveals the truth." The impact was immediate. The business world began to look at Richard with suspicion. What was once an untouchable empire now seemed like a house of cards on the verge of collapse. And Emily watched it all unfold, savoring every moment. But she wasn't done yet. She wanted to see Richard broken, ruined, destroyed, and now she was ready for the final blow. By this point, Richard was desperate. He had tried everything to keep his company afloat, but the damage was done. Lancaster Innovations' stock plummeted. The few investors who remained began pulling their funds, and the company spiraled into crisis. Then, Richard received an unexpected offer: an investment proposal from Emily Carter. His eyes widened as he read her name on the documents. Emily? Investing in me? But he had no options left. If he didn't secure funding soon, he would lose everything. Swallowing his pride but with no alternative, Richard agreed to the meeting. And that's when everything changed. The restaurant chosen for the meeting was one of the most luxurious in New York, the same place where, years ago, Richard had taken Bella Devereaux for dinner while Emily cried alone at home. Now Emily was the one in power. When Richard arrived, she was already there, seated elegantly, a glass of wine in her hand, her eyes locked on him. She wanted him to feel every second of this humiliation. Richard approached the table and sat. across from her. For a moment he just stared. She was unrecognizable. This wasn't the devoted, submissive wife he had abandoned. This was a cold, calculating businesswoman, and far more powerful than he had ever imagined. "So, Emily?" He forced a smile, trying to maintain his composure. "You want to invest in my company?" She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "No." Richard's smile vanished. "What? But you called this meeting." She took a sip of her wine, then said calmly, "I did, but not to invest. I just wanted to see your face when you realized you've lost everything." Richard's hand tightened around the glass in front of him. "Emily, listen, No, I made mistakes," she laughed. A low, almost mocking laugh. "No, Richard. You didn't just make mistakes, you destroyed me. You threw me away like I was nothing, and you thought there would never be consequences." He swallowed hard. "I can still rebuild my company." Emily cut him off. "You have nothing left, Richard. Your investors ran. Your businesses collapsed. And Bella Devereaux? She left the moment she realized you were out of money." His face went pale. "What?" She smiled. "She abandoned you, just like you did to me. Ironic, isn't it?" Richard said nothing. He knew it was true. Emily slowly stood up, grabbing her purse. "I just wanted you to see what happens when you play with the wrong person. But now my revenge is over. I don't need you anymore." She looked at him one last time. "Good luck, Richard. You're going to need it." Then she turned and walked away. Richard remained there, alone, in the same restaurant where he once felt on top of the world. Now, he was nothing but a broken man, bankrupt and abandoned. Emily Carter had won. But would Richard accept his downfall without a fight? Richard Lancaster's life crumbled in a matter of weeks. What was once an unshakable empire was now nothing more than ruins. Without investors, without money, and without allies, he was forced to sell off his last remaining assets to cover his debts. The mansion where he had lived with Emily, and later, with Bella Devereaux, sold. The luxury cars, auctioned off. The last shares of his company, devalued to almost nothing. And Bella, she vanished the moment she realized Richard could no longer afford to sustain her lifestyle. Then came the final blow, like a knife to the chest. Bella Devereaux was spotted in Paris, passionately kissing a young billionaire heir. Richard tasted the bitter sting of humiliation. Now, he had nothing. Nothing. The man who had once walked away from Emily without a second thought was now living in a modest rented apartment, drinking cheap whiskey and reading headlines that mocked his downfall. But Emily wasn't finished yet. There was still one final act before the curtain closed. The last move Emily had been watching from afar. She knew Richard had hit rock bottom. But revenge wasn't just about destroying someone. It was about ensuring they never got back up. That's when she had an idea, a final move. She reached out to one of her trusted journalists and leaked financial documents exposing every one of Richard's business failures. The next morning, the news spread like wildfire. Exclusive: the fall of Richard Lancaster, how the former billionaire destroyed his own fortune. The article laid it all bare. Every debt, every failed deal, every reckless decision. There was no way out. Richard was no longer just a broke man. He was a laughingstock in the financial world. And in the midst of it all, Emily savored her victory. But then, something happened that she didn't expect. That night, Emily was in her luxurious Manhattan apartment, sipping wine as she skimmed through the latest news. Then her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Emily, please. I need to talk to you. It's important. Richard." She stared at the screen, surprised. Richard was asking for help? For a moment, she laughed. The irony of the situation was delicious, but then something inside her hesitated. Why was he reaching out? What did he want? After a few seconds of reflection, she replied, "Tomorrow, same restaurant." If he wanted to talk, she would give him that chance. But not out of pity. She just wanted to see the desperation on his face. The next day, Emily arrived at the restaurant, her posture flawless as always. But when she saw Richard, something surprised her. He was no longer the confident man who had abandoned her years ago. He was wrecked. His beard was unkempt, dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his once impeccable clothing was now far less refined. He looked like a man on the verge of collapse. Emily sat down calmly, crossing her legs as she studied him. "What do you want, Richard?" He took a deep breath as if gathering his strength. "I know you hate me, Emily. I know I did unforgivable things. But I need help." She raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Help? You want me to help you?" Richard lowered his gaze. "I have nothing left, Emily. I lost everything. My money, my reputation. And now, I don't know what to do." She let out a dry chuckle. "Interesting. And what exactly do you expect me to do?" He looked up at her, and for the first time Emily saw something she had never seen in him before. Genuine vulnerability. "I don't want money. I just don't know how to start over." For a moment, Emily felt something strange. It wasn't pity. It was something deeper. For years she had dreamed of this moment. She had wanted to see him broken, ruined, begging. And now that he was sitting there, defeated, she wondered if hating him was still worth it. She leaned forward, her sharp eyes analyzing every detail of the man before her. "You destroyed me, Richard. You abandoned me like I was nothing. And now, you expect me to forget all of that?" He exhaled heavily. "No, I know I don't deserve that. I just don't know where to go from here." A long silence fell between them. Emily took a deep breath and then, slowly said, "I can't forgive you, Richard. But maybe I can teach you something you never learned. How to rebuild." He stared at her, surprised. Emily Carter was a winner. And for the first time, Richard Lancaster was willing to learn from her. Emily watched Richard sitting across from her. The man who had once destroyed her life was now in ruins, asking for guidance. For years she had wished to see him like this. She had dreamed of this exact moment, where he would finally realize that his arrogance had led to his own downfall. But now that he was here, vulnerable, she asked herself, was it enough? She picked up her wine glass, swirling the liquid slowly before speaking. "What exactly do you want from me, Richard?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want money. I know I have nothing left to offer, but I need to understand how to start over. I spent so long thinking I was untouchable, and now I don't know what to do." Emily crossed her arms, leaning forward. "And why should I care?" Richard met her gaze with sincerity. "You don't have to, but I needed to say it." A long silence settled between them. As much as she hated him, she knew exactly what he was feeling. She had once been lost too. She had once believed there was no way out. But the difference between them was simple. She knew how to rise again. And now she had the power to decide Richard Lancaster's fate. She could destroy him completely, or let him sink on his own. Emily Carter was no longer the naive woman he had abandoned years ago. She knew exactly what needed to be done. She took a deep breath and with a cold gaze said, "I taught you a lesson, Richard. Now, what you do with it is no longer my problem." She stood up, grabbed her purse and gave him one last look. "I hope you've learned." And then she turned and walked away, leaving Richard behind. As Emily stepped out of the restaurant, she felt something inside her. For the first time in years, she was truly free. Richard Lancaster no longer mattered. Her hatred for him dissolved. Her revenge complete. She never had to look back again. She had won. And most importantly, she had rebuilt herself. 6 months later, Richard Lancaster vanished from the business world. With no money, no allies, and no reputation, he became nothing more than a memory of the powerful man he once was. Some said he had moved to another city, trying to live away from the spotlight. Others believed he was still struggling to make a comeback, but without success. But to Emily Carter, he simply didn't exist anymore. Her focus was on the future. Her company was growing stronger every day, and her name had become a symbol for women who had learned never to be stepped on again. And for the first time, Emily understood the true essence of revenge. The greatest victory wasn't destroying someone. It was proving that no one could destroy you. If you loved this story full of revenge, twists, and resilience, don't leave without subscribing to the channel. Here you'll always find captivating stories that will keep you hooked from beginning to end. And now I want to hear from you. If you were in Emily's place, would you have forgiven Richard? Or would you have destroyed him even more? Leave your opinion in the comments. I'd love to know what you would do in this situation. And of course, don't forget to hit the like button so more people can discover this incredible story.